Welcome back to News Talk here on News Channel 8. We turn our attention now to the district's push for representation in Congress, which now appears badly stalled. While advocates like Eleanor Holmes Norton and groups like DC Vote tend to get the press when it comes to voting rights advocacy, they are not the only activists out there. Tim Cooper is Executive Director of World Rights. He has traveled the globe to make the case for the people of the nation's capital, and he has come up with a new strategy that he thinks may help the cause. Welcome, and thank you very much for coming in. It's great to see you again.
So very good to be here.
Is this the first time you've talked publicly about this new legal strategy that I know you've spent a long time working on?
It is. So this is the premier engagement of the concept. Let me also say that this concept goes back about 15 years. 15 years ago, it occurred to me that if we begin to work the international human rights legal system, that is to prove that the district status is in fact a violation of international law, we might then at a later time be able to bring it back into U.S. courts to prove that our status violates customary international law, which in fact is binding both on state courts and the U.S. Supreme Court.
Let's take the first part of that first. Has that first box been checked, in your view?
It has indeed. It took about 10, 15 years to go around the globe and actually get various human rights bodies, the United Nations, the Organization of American States, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, all of these major international institutions to come on board and declare the status of the district residents as a violation of international human rights standards. That has happened. Now, the question is, what do we do with that?
Because you have traveled to The Hague and other places, right? I say this in the interest of people understanding kind of some of the history, not puffery or you know, being your PR guy. Give us a sense of, just briefly, of some of the places you've traveled and the international human rights groups with whom you've engaged.
Right. Well, I've traveled extensively to Geneva, Switzerland, to the United Nations based out of Geneva. I've traveled extensively to Warsaw, Poland, which is the headquarters for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I've also traveled to the UN in New York and various other places to pursue this cause, to make the case. And in fact, over the years, this case was heard, this case was declared favorably on behalf of the district residents, and so now the question is, as I said, what do we do with this gold?
So we have these findings. What would step 2 in this lengthy process look like?
Okay, the concept of this suit is novel. And I did happen to see Mark Plotkin on the way over here, and he said, say something provocative. And I said, Mark, if you would read my treatise, you would understand that this is provocative. And by that I mean that the concept for this lawsuit is to sue the legislatures of the 50 states who have effectively denied district residents the right to a constitutional amendment that would endow them with full congressional voting representation, let alone full autonomous rights. So the idea is to go directly to the U.S. Supreme Court, suing the 50 states, or the legislators of the 50 states, and declare that their reticence to grant us a constitutional amendment is in fact a violation of customary international law, which is binding on both the states and the U.S. Supreme Court.
Would that entail being in 50 capitals, or can one
That's a great question.
legal challenge
Right.
Get it where you hope to be?
That's the idea behind going directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's this legal idea called original jurisdiction, and that allows states to sue other states directly to the U.S. Supreme Court without going through federal court, but directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. So the concept here, because the district is treated as a state, 537 federal statutes declare the District of Columbia to be a state. The Supreme Court has treated the district as a state. Congress has treated the district as a state. For jurisdictional purposes only, to get before the U.S. Supreme Court with this case on universal jurisdiction, we would apply to the U.S. Supreme Court and say, for all intents and purposes, we are a state for original jurisdiction, and we want you to hear the merits of our case.
Will you be, pardon me, don't know why I have a frog in my throat. Will you be moving forward now as a claimant, as a plaintiff, whatever, I'm no lawyer, obviously, whatever the right legal word is? Do you, Tim Cooper, move forward now, or do you do it perhaps in conjunction with you know, average people, citizens who are not activists in any commonly understood sense, because that's a common strategy.
Yeah.
How do you move forward
This
now?
is a very important and very, very good question. Basically, the District of Columbia would have to file suit. That is, the mayor of Washington, D.C. would have to file suit. So we need the mayor's consent, buy-in, to accomplish this. We need basically 6 people. We need the mayor of the District of Columbia, and we need 5 Supreme Court justices. Now, there are 5 Supreme Court justices currently sitting on the bench, or about to sit on the bench, who support the idea of using foreign law, international law, in U.S. jurisprudence. There are 4 who are definitely against it, but there are 5, and all we need is 5 who are for it. So we think that if the mayor were to file this suit, and if we can get over some of these obstacles of common law immunity and so forth, that we then have only 5 Supreme Court justices to convince. And that, I think, is very different than convincing the entire United States Congress to move ahead with our issue.
Having read some of your material, I want you to restate, because I think it's so central to the thrust of the work you've been doing. You're suing the 50 legislatures rather than a kind of swing for the fences, D.C. versus U.S. or
Right.
D.C. versus Congress.
Right.
D.C. versus the 50 states. I want you to go right at that again.
Yeah, because that is central, that is key. The state legislators are not immune from violating constitutional rights. In other words, if we can prove that they are in fact violating our constitutional rights under the Bill of Rights and under international customary law, they are in fact liable to the courts. Okay, they are subject to the courts. And what we are looking for with the Supreme Court is injunctive relief, not declaratory relief, but injunctive relief, where the Supreme Court says there are violations of international law here, there are violations of Bill of Rights. You, the 50 states, legislators of the 50 states, are hereby commanded to pass or convene a constitutional amendment and pass a constitutional amendment which would provide D.C. residents the rights consistent with statehood, the rights consistent with full and equal political rights.
About 90 seconds left in this segment, maybe a little less. Justices who have referred to international norms, international standards, international law, what have you, have been criticized. Does that hurt the thrust?
I don't think so. I think the only thing that matters...
I think that came up in death penalty, if I'm not mistaken.
It did, and I think that was Justice Stevens who wrote that opinion. But I think all we need are 5 justices to make a declaration that our status violates international law. And I think, you know, whether they use international law, whether they use the Bill of Rights or a combination of the two, I think we have a very, very substantial claim, and potentially this is an important strategy. Just
briefly, in terms of your dealings on the international stage, were folks inclined to be sympathetic to your thrust because they genuinely believed it, or because here's an opportunity to stick it to the U.S., which is always telling everyone else how to behave?
Well, I mean, the rights enshrined under international law are universal rights. So we just simply point to those rights and say, well, we don't have these rights. Help us get these rights and apply these standards. And that's all that we ever did.
Talking with Timothy Cooper, Executive Director of World Rights. We'll pause here. Back with more News Talk right after this.